It is July, sometime in the 1880s, on a farm in Lancaster County. There is no electricity on this property. There is no refrigeration. There is no air conditioning, no electric fan, no ice maker, nothing that runs on a current that does not exist yet. The temperature outside is 91 degrees and has been above 85 for 11 days in a row. Inside the farmhouse, the family is eating a meal that includes cold butter, fresh milk that has not soured, a small piece of meat that was slaughtered 3 days ago and is still good, and a pitcher of water that is noticeably cooler than the air temperature in the room. None of this should be possible. And yet every one of those things was real, was common, was routine on farms across this region and across this country for generations. Because those families understood something about physics that most people today have completely forgotten about. Something that requires no electricity, no moving parts, no ongoing expense, and no maintenance beyond restocking a single ingredient that costs about $1.50. That ingredient is salt. Not in the way you put salt on food, in a very specific way that exploits a property of salt that has been known and used by human beings for so long that we have essentially forgotten it was ever a discovery at all. The same way we have forgotten that fire was a discovery, or that fermentation was a discovery, because these things have simply always been part of how people lived. I am going to show you how this works, why it works, the exact physics of what is happening, and how to set up a version of this system in your own home using nothing you need to order online or buy at a specialty store. I want you to understand it deeply enough that you could explain it to someone else, because when you understand why something works, you can adapt it, you can improve it, and you can trust it in a way that you cannot trust a method you simply follow by rote. My name is Hope Yoda, and I have been thinking about this for a long time. We live on a property where power outages are not uncommon in summer, where the electric bill in July and August is something my wife and I have had real conversations about, and where the question of what we would actually do if the grid went down for an extended period is not hypothetical. It is a question I have wanted a real answer to, not a survivalist answer, not a theoretical answer, but the same kind of practical answer the people who built this farmhouse would have given you without hesitation. This is that answer. Let me start with the physics, because it is elegant, and once you see it, you will recognize it in a dozen other places. When salt dissolves in water, something happens at the molecular level that requires energy. The process of dissolving, of breaking apart the crystal lattice structure of the salt and dispersing the sodium and chloride ions throughout the water, is an endothermic process for certain salts. Endothermic means it absorbs energy from its surroundings rather than releasing it. The energy it absorbs comes in the form of heat, drawn from whatever is in contact with the salt solution. The solution gets colder, the surroundings lose heat. This is not a small effect. A saturated solution of ammonium nitrate in water, for example, can drop to temperatures below freezing from room temperature water in a matter of seconds. This is the chemistry behind those instant cold packs that athletes use when they injure a knee on the field. The ones where you squeeze the pack and it gets cold immediately. There is no ice in those packs. There is only a salt and water that have never been mixed. And when you break the barrier between them and they dissolve, the heat required to make that happen comes from the pack itself and from your skin. But the salt-based cooling system I want to show you does not use that one-time dissolving reaction. What the old farm families used was something more elegant and more sustainable than a one-use cold pack. They used the physics of evaporation combined with salt in a way that created a continuous cooling effect that lasted as long as the system was maintained. Here is the principle. Evaporation is also an endothermic process. When water evaporates from a surface, the molecules that leave the surface are the fastest moving, highest energy molecules in the liquid. Their departure takes energy with them, leaving the remaining liquid and the surface it was resting on cooler than before. This is why you feel cold when you step out of a swimming pool on a hot day, even when the air temperature is 90 degrees. The water evaporating from your skin is carrying heat away with it, This is also why sweating works, why dogs pant, why every warm-blooded creature that needs to shed excess heat does so through some form of evaporative cooling. The problem with plain water evaporation as a cooling method is that it is limited by the humidity of the surrounding air. In very humid conditions, the air is already saturated with water vapor, and evaporation slows dramatically or stops. You feel hot and sticky in humid weather, even when you are sweating, because the sweat is not evaporating the way it should, because the air cannot absorb much more moisture. In a dry climate, evaporation works extremely well. In a humid climate, it works less well. Salt changes this calculation in a specific and useful way. A concentrated salt solution, brine, evaporates differently than plain water, and the salt itself is hygroscopic, meaning it actively absorbs moisture from the surrounding air rather than just releasing moisture into it. A container of saturated salt solution placed in an enclosed space does something that plain water does not. It both evaporates from its surface, cooling the liquid and the surrounding air as it does, and it absorbs humidity from the air around it, which means the air in the space is being dried slightly even as it is being cooled. Drier air allows faster evaporation from other surfaces in the same space, which means the cooling effect compounds. The salt is not just cooling the air, it is creating the conditions that allow more cooling to happen from every surface in the space. This is the principle behind what is sometimes called a salt cooling system, though the old farm families who used it would not have called it that. They would have called it the way they kept things cool, because that is what it was. A method so integrated into how they lived that it did not have a special name. Let me now describe the actual systems they used, from the simplest to the more sophisticated, and then I will show you how to set up a version that works in a modern home. The simplest version is what was sometimes called a pot-in-pot cooler, or a Zeer pot in the African tradition, that also used this principle, where it was independently discovered and used for centuries to keep vegetables and dairy fresh in hot, dry conditions. Take a clay pot, unglazed, the kind that is porous and allows moisture to move through the walls. Set it inside a larger clay pot with a gap between them of 1 inch or 2. Fill that gap with wet sand mixed with salt. Cover the whole thing with a damp cloth. As the moisture in the sand evaporates through the outer pot wall and through the cloth, it draws heat from the inner space, keeping the temperature inside the inner pot significantly lower than the air temperature outside. In dry conditions with good air movement, the interior of such a pot can be 20 to 30 degrees cooler than the outside air. This is where the fresh milk stayed. This is where the butter stayed. This is where a piece of cheese or leftover food could be kept safe for a day or two without any refrigeration in the modern sense. The more sophisticated version, used by farm families with access to stone root cellars, combined this evaporative principle with the Earth's natural insulating temperature, the concept I described in an earlier video about why root cellars work. The salt here played a different role, drawing moisture from the vegetables and other stored goods just enough to keep their surface slightly drier than the air, which slows the growth of the molds and bacteria that cause spoilage, while the evaporating moisture from the salt-dampened walls contributed to the cooling of the space. But the version I want to focus on for your home, because it is the most directly applicable and the most surprising in how well it works, is an air cooling system built around hanging wet burlap or cotton cloth over a wooden frame, with a trough of saturated salt water at the base and a small current of air moving through it, either from natural cross-ventilation or from a hand fan or a small battery-powered fan. Here is how you build it. Take a wooden frame, any rectangular frame made from lumber or even from strong cardboard, sized to fit in a window or a doorway that receives air movement. Hang strips of burlap, loosely woven cotton, or several layers of cheesecloth across this frame, so the air passing through the window or doorway has to pass through the hanging fabric. At the base of the frame, inside, place a trough, a baking pan, a long plastic container, anything that can hold liquid, filled with a saturated saltwater solution. Saturated means you have dissolved as much salt as the water will accept, which is about 3.5 ounces of salt per cup of water, roughly 3.5 tablespoons per cup, until no more salt will dissolve and some sits on the bottom. So Soak the bottom of the hanging fabric strips in this saltwater trough, so they wick the brine upward through the fabric by capillary action. The same way a candle wick draws wax upward. As warm outside air passes through this frame, it contacts the brine-soaked fabric. Two things happen simultaneously. The water in the fabric evaporates into the moving air, cooling it through the same mechanism that makes sweating work. And the salt in the brine, being hygroscopic, pulls additional moisture out of the air itself as it passes through, which both dries the air and draws heat from it in the process of absorbing that moisture. The air coming out the other side of the frame into the room is measurably cooler and drier than the air that went in. In a dry climate, this effect can reduce the temperature of the incoming air by 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. In a moderately humid climate, the effect is smaller, perhaps 5 to 10 degrees, but still meaningful, and it is cumulative over the course of a day when the system runs continuously. The maintenance required is simple. Check the brine level in the trough daily and add water as needed to replace what has evaporated, dissolving additional salt if the concentration has dropped. Rinse the fabric once a week to remove the salt residue that builds up as the water evaporates and the salt concentrates on the fibres. That is all. The cost to set this up is essentially nothing if you have spare wood, spare fabric, and a container you can use as a trough. The salt costs about $1.50 for a large enough quantity to get started, and you only need to add more as the solution concentrates and is replaced with fresh water over time, which is a slow process. I want to be honest with you about the limitations, because I am always honest with you, and this method has real limitations that I would not want you to discover as a surprise. This system works best when there is actual air movement through the frame, either natural wind through a window or some kind of fan. Without air movement, you have wet fabric in a window, which cools the area immediately around it, but does not cool the room. The air needs to be moving through the wet surface to carry the cooling effect into the space. This system works much better in a dry climate than in a humid one. If you are in a coastal region where summer humidity regularly runs above 70 or 80%, the evaporation rate from the fabric surface will be slow, and the salt's ability to pull additional moisture from the air will be working against air that is already nearly saturated. You will get some benefit, but less than someone in a dry interior climate. This is why these systems were historically used most in desert and semi-arid regions, and why the Zeer pot tradition comes from sub-Saharan Africa rather than coastal Europe. This system cools through evaporation, which means it adds some moisture to the air as well as cooling it, which in a very dry climate is actually a benefit, making the cooled space more comfortable, but in an already humid space can feel counterproductive. This system does not replace refrigeration for food safety in the way a modern refrigerator does. The pot-in-pot system can keep dairy and certain foods safe for a day or two in hot weather, but it does not reach the 4 degrees Celsius of a modern refrigerator. Think of it as what it is, a significant improvement over having no cooling at all. A system that kept families fed and healthy through summers without power for generations. Not a substitute for the refrigerator you already have when that refrigerator is working. Now I want to talk about where this fits in the larger picture of what I've been trying to share on this channel, because the salt cooling system is one example of a category of knowledge that I think about often. We stopped using this because we got electricity, and getting electricity was genuinely good. Electric refrigeration is better than a pot-in-pot cooler for food safety. Central air conditioning is more comfortable and more reliable than a saltwater frame in a window. I am not arguing that we should go back to the 1880s. What I am saying is that we traded the old knowledge for the new technology and did not keep both. And now, when the technology fails, as it does, in storms, in long power outages, in the summers that are getting hotter while electric bills are getting higher, we find ourselves without any answer at all. Harold's daughter called me because her father was sitting in a 108-degree house and she did not know what to do. That would not have been true 3 generations earlier. 3 generations earlier, everyone on that road would have known several things to do, because those things were simply part of how you lived. Keeping this knowledge alive is what this channel is about and what the books are about. The cooling methods that work without power. The food preservation that works without refrigeration. The garden knowledge that feeds a family through seasons when stores are not accessible. The healing plant preparations that have been on this property since before any of us were born. The household methods that cost almost nothing and replace products that cost hundreds of dollars a year. All of it written down, all of it tested from real use on this property across generations. The link is in the description, or find everything on our channel. Here is what I would like you to try this weekend. Get a bag of table salt, $1.50 at any grocery store. Fill a bowl or a baking pan with water and dissolve salt into it until no more will dissolve. Find an old cotton cloth, a dish towel, an old t-shirt, anything that will absorb and wick moisture. Hang it in a window where there is a breeze, with the bottom sitting in the salt water. Stand in front of that window for 5 minutes and feel what the air coming through it feels like compared to the air coming through an uncovered window nearby. Then tell me in the comments what you felt, what your climate is, and whether this is something you could see building into something more permanent in your home. And if your grandparents or great-grandparents had any version of this, or any other cooling method they used before electric air conditioning, please share it. Those methods that nobody wrote down because everyone already knew them are the ones most at risk of being lost completely. And I would genuinely like to know what yours were. Next time, I'm going to show you the winter side of this same principle. How the same physics that allows salt to absorb heat in summer allows it to generate heat in winter. The hand warmer that has been in work coat pockets on farms like this one since long before the electric hand warmer existed. And how to make it yourself from the same bag of salt for essentially no cost. Subscribe so you do not miss it. That $1.50 bag has been doing this work on farms and in homes since before the grid existed. And in any home that remembers, it still does.